Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, or whenever you have chosen to watch this lecture. Welcome to lecture number 2. This lecture is concerned with issues related to human communication processes in the small group context. Uh, Most of you are communication majors or have at least taken a communication course, so some of this might be repeat, but these very foundational elements of the communication process are really important to understand because they have an especially salient influence on our success communicating in small groups. We know that it's not just about communication. There's a lot of theory in here too. Those that have taken a communication theory course, you're going to see a lot of elements of theory and philosophy coming into play here. So feel free to bring any questions related to that to class when we talk about this chapter. But let's delve right in because we've got a lot to cover in this lecture. I want to revisit and first go back to the basics and talk about what does communication look like? We know what communication is, right? Or we at least know how to communicate. We do it all the time. But let's talk about the very basics. And we're going to revisit the most basic model of communication, which is the communication transaction model. And I want to bring in two of my absolute favorite people to have a conversation with us. And those people are Hillary and Ellen. So sorry if you hate them, but I think they'll help us get our point across. So let's assume that Hillary Clinton and Ellen DeGeneres were going to have a conversation. So Hillary says to Ellen, "Girl, Bill's hair is so luscious. I just want to reach out and run my fingers through it." To which Ellen replies, "I was just thinking the same thing. I'm just saying, if this was baseball, I'd switch teams." And let's assume I jump in this conversation and say, "Oh my gosh, holy crap, you guys are talking about me." Okay, let's step back and just look at even though this is a ridiculous conversation, let's look at the communication components here. First and foremost, we have a sender, somebody that formulates a message and starts the conversation. Then we have a receiver who also becomes a sender. Sorry, the font's cut off, but you get the picture. They become the sender when they send another message back. So we've got the initial sender, which is Hillary, and then the receiver, which is Ellen. Hillary sends what's called a message. And I know this is very basic, but it's important to understand. Her message is what starts the whole conversation. What Ellen sends back is also, yes, a message, but we call it feedback because it's contingent on the original message being sent. Okay? And then I'm noise here. Now, noise can be pretty much anything, whether it's somebody entering into the conversation that wasn't meant to be in that conversation, or it could be somebody's cell phone going off. It could be somebody falling asleep during a meeting. It's anything that takes away from the integrity or the intended integrity of the communication situation. Anything that's a distraction is noise. Okay? So let's take away some of these elements and talk a little bit more about the deeper elements of the communication transaction model. So we know that Ellen says back to Hillary, "Yes, I was thinking the same thing. I'm just saying, if this was baseball, I'd switch teams." To which Hillary might reply, "Baseball? Girl, get it together. I'm talking about Phil." So clearly, something going on here, a communication breakdown, right? Ellen is encoding a message with a little bit of a euphemism for her sexuality, right? She's saying, I might consider going straight because Phil's hair is so luscious. How cocky of me to formulate this conversation, right? And then Hillary would say, "I don't get it. I'm talking about Phil, not baseball." She's decoding or interpreting a message in a way that it's not meant to be interpreted. This is where communication breakdowns happen. Now, I understand that this is a completely ridiculous example, but I hope it'll help you see a little bit more about the most basic components of the communication model. And those components are sender, receiver, message, feedback, noise, encoding, and decoding. But this doesn't just happen, right? We know that communication doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a specific context. Now, what is a context? Well, the book defines it as this, and I think it's a pretty accurate definition. It's the situation or environment that influences the dynamics of communication. So, context is the place or the space in which communication happens. And we know that there are many contexts communicatively. There are public contexts. There are interpersonal contexts. There are public interpersonal hybrid contexts in which, yes, we communicate interpersonally, but in a way that's strategic and presenting ourselves in a specific way publicly. And then there are small group contexts. And there are many others, but I want you to note that most of these are actually strategic, right? With the exception maybe of interpersonal communication. We know that the way we present ourselves is a core component of a lot of these. We're really concerned with how we present ourselves publicly, interpersonally, hybridly, and then in small group situations. There's a really big, distinct interpersonal element. A lot of these have a strategic component, which is why it's important to understand and navigate the small group communication process. Now, we know there are a variety of things that influence small group communication and the small group communication context. First of which is just the simple number of people involved in a conversation. 2 people is not a small group, but 3 or more is. But the more people you involve, the more psychologically complex the conversation becomes, right? So let's say, yes, Ellen and Hillary are having a conversation, but she adds Bill, me, and another one of my favorite people, Rachel Maddow. This is going to be pretty psychologically complex conversation, right? It's not just Hillary and Ellen. There are many other multidimensional personalities coming out now, right? So it's going to take the conversation in a different way than if it was just Hillary and Ellen or just Hillary, Ellen, and Bill. We sat down to figure this out, and with a 5-person small group, there are over 90 relationships. So there could be just a relationship between me and Rachel, a relationship between Rachel, me, and Bill, between Rachel, Hillary, and Ellen. There are over 90 relationships in a 5-person small group. So as you can imagine, that definitely influences the direction in which group communication navigates. Second, or third, those first two kind of go hand in hand. The more communicators we have, typically the goals of a small group get tossed to the hindsight and the goals of individuals become more salient. I think of The View, and The View is not something that I watch very often, but I think, my gosh, these women are really kind of combating each other. They're speaking over each other all the time. There's no real group goal here, right? It's individual goals. Elizabeth Hasselbeck wants to talk about the conservative side of things. Joy Behar wants to talk about the liberal side of things. Barbara Walters wants to be balanced. Whoopi Goldberg wants to throw something ridiculous in. Sherry Shepard wants to be the humorous relief. They all have individual goals, and they really come out when you watch The View. So the more members you add, typically we have to watch out to make sure that individuals' goals are not superseding the goals of the group as a whole. And then finally, we know that in small groups, the roles of participants often become formalized in a way that they don't in interpersonal communication. Think of the Avengers, right? Each of these people has a specific goal, a specific talent, a specific thing they bring to the group. Well, the same thing happens in organizational settings in small groups. We've got note takers, we've got leaders, we've got followers, we've got goof-offs. We've got people that assume specific roles, and the roles that they assume definitely influence their communication practices within the small group. So those are some things that influence small group communication. And there's been a key word that's been popping out throughout this lecture, and that word is communication. And it's not a word we're unfamiliar with. Most of us are communication majors, and if you're not, again, you've likely had some experience with communication courses, but we say this word a lot, and I question if we really know what it means. So let's revisit the most basic definition. And I think this is a really solid working definition, and we're going to define communication as this. It is a transactional process, so going back to the transaction model that we saw at the beginning, a transactional process by which people simultaneously create, interpret, and negotiate shared meaning through their interaction. A key component here is the term shared meaning. If ever you find a definition for communication that doesn't talk about shared meaning, throw it out, because it is not accurate. That is a core principle of communication studies, that communication is focused on creating shared meaning. And by shared meaning, we simply mean that my mind is going to get on the same page as your mind through communication. That's how we use communication as a vehicle by which we get on the same page, so to speak. So I think that that's a really, really important definition to understand, to know, to be prepared to talk about on a test. Perhaps know that definition. All right. So let's move on to talk about some principles of communication. The first principle I want to discuss is that human communication is symbolic. Now, why in the world do I have a picture of a cat here? Well, I want to talk about the symbolic nature of words. When I say the word cat, and assuming you haven't seen this picture, what do you think of? This is what I think of. An orange cat, maybe some stripes in the tail, middle-aged, not a kitty, not a cat that's about to die, just a nice orange cat. But you might think of something different, right? You might think of a gray cat or a black cat or a calico cat or some other type of cat based on your personal symbolic experience with cats. And there are many words to describe cats. Each elicits a different mental picture. So this is what I see when I hear the word cat or see the word cat. But what about when I see or hear the word kitten or kitty or feline? I think of something different for all of those words because there's a personal element here. Those words are symbolic. Let's talk about dogs. We know there are many words to describe dogs, right? There's dog, there's puppy, there's canine, and likely you have a mental picture that's different for each one of those words. Let's take canine specifically. We know the dog is a canine, correct? But when I say canine, you might picture this, or you might picture teeth, or you might picture a canine dog unit, a police unit. Because that word or that term, whether via the way it sounds or just the way that it's constructed mentally, has different meanings, elicits different meanings among different people and different people groups. So the first thing that's important to realize is that communication is symbolic. Something you should write down, take note of, and know that it will come up later in the semester is the idea of this. That meaning is not found in words, it's found in people. Words have no real meaning. We ascribe meaning to them. Meaning is found in people. We're going to navigate this and talk a little bit more about it in class. When we say that human communication is symbolic, we need to define symbol. And a symbol is simply this: an arbitrary human creation used to represent something with which it has no inherent relationship. Again, all words are symbols. In and of themselves, they have no meaning. We give meaning to words. The second principle of communication that informs our thinking is that human communication is personal. So just look at this graph, right? This is a fun little graph from BuzzFeed, my biggest waste of time, charting how people say soda. Okay, so I'm from originally exactly right here and then right here. So you can see I very much fall in the red. I call it soda. Yeah, that's accurate. However, I have a lot of friends from down here, because I lived up here, so the south, that call it a Coke. Whether it's Sprite, whether it's Mountain Dew, whether it's Dr. Pepper, everything's a Coke. That's so strange, but it's based on that personal element. I moved out here, and I now live, geez, where are we? Here? Is this us? Yes, right here, where people call it a pop. And when I first heard somebody say pop for soda, I thought, what the heck is a pop? But I finally got it, and I understand. The point in all of this is that we communicate about certain things and even certain words based on our personal preferences, our personal ideologies, the way we were raised, the geographic location we were raised. It's personal. And we make communication personal, right? So here I introduce you to my lovely wife. This is not my kid, but stock images are great. And I say, hey baby. Well, even the very basic term baby has different meanings, right? I say baby to my wife all the time, but you probably don't think of my wife when I say the word baby. You probably think of this, right? Or something similar to this. It's because it's personal. We think about how these words have personal meaning in our lives based on where we are in life. Thirdly, human communication is transactional, just like we talked about at the beginning. We've got this transactional model of communication. And by that, we mean that all interactants or communicators mutually and simultaneously define themselves and others during communication. Ellen reveals stuff about herself in the conversation. Hillary reveals things about herself in a conversation just by the words that they use and by the meaning that they're attempting to co-create. So it's important to know that communication is transactional. Other people may tell you that it's not, and there are modes and models of communication that are not transactional, but for the purpose of this course, I think it's important to think of communication as a transaction. And then finally, communication is not always intentional. This is where we see the role of nonverbal communication, which we're going to talk about later on in this lecture. But we know that our nonverbals are not intentional. They sometimes give the audience cues as to what we're really feeling, even though we don't intend for them to do. So in this picture, we see frustration. Nonverbals show frustration. They show happiness. They reveal our stress, our tiredness, our disdain. They reveal other awkward things. This is a big picture that blew up about a year ago. But our eye gaze, our tone, our facial expressions, our sense of touch, those all influence our communication, whether or not they're intentional. And then know that communication finally involves content and relational dimensions. They don't just occur, these conversations. They are really a complex process. Think about, again, the roles that the women on The View play. There are complex relational dimensions between Elizabeth Hasselbeck and Joy Behar, who come from different political ideologies. Here we have Barbara Walters and Whoopi Goldberg, also two different, very rigid, very unstructured. There's elements of race, there's elements of class, there's a lot of different elements of here that influence the communication process. So know that communication and the communication process involves content and relational dimensions. All right, so I know that was a lot. We have a little bit more to cover. So far, we've really assumed that communication is all about speaking, which is not true. Listening is also a key part. And I want to really talk about the difference between listening and hearing. Hearing is what happens physiologically when things register in our earlobes, and I don't know the physiological makeup of hearing, but when sounds register in our ears, that's hearing. Listening really occurs up here in our brain. It's when we comprehend things. Here's the actual definition from the book. It's receiving and interpreting oral and other signals from another person or source. So hearing happens when we receive those signals, but we can't really listen until we interpret what they mean, and that happens up here. We know that we have different types of listeners. Obviously, listening is a key part of the communication process, but we know that there are many different types of listeners. We're going to kind of run through this quickly. There are many different types. The first type is people-oriented listeners, and those are those who are sensitive to others. They're non-judgmental. They're really concerned with how their behavior affects others. They're empathetic a lot of times. Now, there's a downside to this in that these people can really sometimes be distracted from the task at hand because they're so focused on people. They interpret messages with people in mind. The second type of listener we have are action-oriented listeners, and these people are really just the opposite. They are so focused on the task at hand that they're not as empathetic. They're not people-minded. They focus on tasks, they remember the details, and really they prefer organized presentations that keep the organization or the task at the forefront. Third, we have content-oriented listeners. These are people that really enjoy analyzing, critiquing, dissecting others' arguments and information. The downside to this is sometimes these people can be seen as hypercritical because they dissect everything. They play the devil's advocate, sometimes too much. They're good, especially in higher echelon small groups, groups that have to make really complex, important decisions, but they can be hypercritical in small groups that have a smaller function. And then finally, there are time-oriented listeners. These are people who are sensitive to time. They might be impatient. They might try to move the meeting faster than it should be going because they want to close prematurely because they're so focused on time and saving time and energy. And typically, we know that groups consist of many different types of listeners. Therefore, there are rules for listening to help us navigate these complex listening relationships that we have in groups. These are pretty simple, so we're just going to kind of read them off. We know that good listeners should pay attention to the context of what is said. They shouldn't just isolate words. They need to pay attention to context because, as we talked about earlier in this lecture, context really is key. Second, good listeners pay close attention to the feelings of the speaker. They need to be somewhat people-minded. Whether they're action-oriented or they're time-focused, that doesn't matter. They really do need to be at least somewhat people-oriented. They need to help facilitate understanding in a group. They need to contribute to helping create shared meaning among all group members. They must interpret silence, and I interject here and say other nonverbals carefully. Don't interpret things hypercritically. Interpret them in context. Listen actively. Don't just pick and choose what you listen to. Listen to the whole communication conversation, which really is the whole communication context. And then be a careful repeater. This goes along with conversations of gossip and managing misinformation. Make sure that as you repeat what others have said, that you keep the original context in mind. All right? So I think it's also important to note that speaking and listening happens differently in different contexts, right? I think we're kind of assuming that small group communication looks like this, right? And it does, but it also looks like this, and this, and this. We're moving more and more into the digital age, and we're seeing the consequences of that in small groups. We use communication technologies in long distances, and we do it more and more interpersonally as well. This definitely influences something called our social presence. So I think of social presence as this. I'm going to define it for you before we talk about it. It's the extent to which group members perceive that a particular communication medium is socially and emotionally similar to face-to-face communication. Now, obviously, this is my wife here on the side. If I'm going to talk to her, probably the most rich communication experience I can have with my wife is to talk to her face-to-face, right? But unfortunately, that's not always possible. I'm a grad student. She works at a very, very high stress, high paced job. We're gone 12 to 14 hours a day. We don't get to see each other nearly as much as we would like. So we're forced to interact with each other via text message, via Facebook, via email, via computer mediated communication all day long. Now, obviously, this isn't as rich, but we've kind of co-created this meaning that this really is a rich process for us, maybe richer than most people because this is all we have to hold on to. So here's a text message. I give you a glimpse into my personal life. But this is something called social presence. Know that social presence is interpreted differently among different people and people groups. But as a whole, it's the extent to which group members really perceive that the communication medium is okay, that it's emotionally and socially similar to what you would get in a face-to-face interaction. So before we move on, let's talk about the differences between computer-mediated communication and face-to-face communication. We know that there are huge differences, right? And I'll allow you to read this on your own time. This is something that's important. You might want to take note of it for an exam or something like that. But they're all fairly obvious. We know that there are key benefits to face-to-face communication that you miss out on in computer-mediated communication. But we also know that computer-mediated communication, is opening up doors that we haven't had in face-to-face interaction. So they're both important. We just need to understand that the way we communicate is different based on this communication medium. One of the last things I want to talk about in this lecture that's highly important is nonverbals. And nonverbals are simply messages other than words. It's important to know that nonverbals play a key role, especially in the small group communication process. Again, as we talked about, the communication process in small groups is very multidimensional. The more people you add, the more psychologically complex it gets. So nonverbals become an especially salient cue for how to understand the communication context. We know that physical appearance plays a key role. We read people's faces, we read their attire to get a sense for what they're really saying beneath their messages that come out of the mouth. We know that space and proxemics are also a key nonverbal, how we use these zones. And here's a map, and it's a suggested map. I don't know that there's one agreed upon map for what's okay, but this is the social zone. It's typically 3 to 5 feet away. And then we have the audience zone, in which there's a public. There's an intimate zone, in which there needs to be an invitation over here. Then there's the friend zone, which has a little more leeway than the social zone. But where we stand, literally stand in proximity to others, gives us some context and some nonverbal context to the conversation. We know that eye contact is obviously a huge one. When somebody's looking you in the eye, it's a deeper communication experience than when they're looking at their phone, right? We know that facial expressions are also a key cue and give us a little bit more of an understanding about people's intent, about their message, about a variety of things related to their communication. Movement is also key. Those who are constantly yawning and stretching communicate a message different than those who are on the edge of their seat with their knees down and their arms down, intent and paying attention. Those are different messages that are communicated with nonverbals. Vocal cues such as pitch, rate, fluency, pronunciation, force, the tonal quality, even pauses, they give us a context to attribute meaning to a message. Even things like regional dialect or saying pop instead of soda give us a cue and some context for the communication that's going on. Touch is also a huge one. When somebody touches us, it elicits certain feelings. It does something to us communicatively. So it's also a key thing, especially something that we miss out on in computer-mediated communication. Then time is also a cue. Now, we've probably run into these nonverbals before. You've probably talked about them even in your most basic communication studies course, the public speaking course. But what about in computer-mediated contexts? How do you communicate nonverbally? Well, I don't know that there's one way, but we know that there are a few ways we communicate nonverbally. Emoticons are one, right? What does this say? Would you text this to your boss? Would you text this to your boss? Would you text this to your boss? They communicate different messages, right? We also know that punctuation is something that has more meaning in a computer-mediated context than probably a spoken context, definitely in a spoken context. So this communicates something differently than if I were just to say what with one question mark. Capitalizing words also elicits some type of tonal quality into a message that would typically not have that quality. When we say these messages out loud, you will come down here right now. It stresses something. It provides a little bit of a nonverbal cue or context. Ellipses do this as well. ... has different meanings for different people. And acronyms such as WTF, OMG, they also have specific meanings and give some nonverbal context. So really, we've hit on a lot in this lecture, but it's all under the umbrella of the same thing, and that is the general communication context. When we revisit, we think that communication cannot happen without context. You cannot understand small group communication apart from the context in which it occurs, and it does occur in a specific context. So read chapter 2, get a better understanding of what that context entails. Again, this lecture doesn't cover everything in the chapter, but it's meant to just give you a little bit more of an explanation about the whole communication context. Bring any questions you have to class. We will discuss this chapter in class. Remember to create your study guide based on this lecture and on the readings and to submit it to Safe Assign. If you have any questions, please bring those to class. Thanks for watching this lecture. I hope it has been informative, and I will